Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's iteration of the Gripped live stream. It's me, Jason Osborne, again, and I must say I'm coming to enjoy this feature of the week, this cozy little live stream we've got going on, and I think it's gone well the past couple of weeks. There hasn't been too much of a plan to it. I've been kind of discussing things I've been interested in, and that I feel are little discussed in the rest of the Irish media, and we're going to continue that this week. It was if you're not of faith, you might think it's serendipitous. If you are of faith, you might say providential, because what I'd planned on discussing was religious freedom and the threat that that is facing. And we're also going to discuss anti-Christian persecution, because that's sort of the aspect of it that I feel gets the least coverage and is the least focused on. Well, I say that at the same time I saw today Nicki Minaj speaking at the UN about anti-Christian persecution, so I can't really make heads or tails of where we're at the moment. Um, Fair play to her. I mean, the more the merrier, and she's got a pretty high profile, so good for her. She seems to have taken a particular interest in the plight of Christians in Nigeria, because obviously we're going to be getting into what's going on there and elsewhere. But um, all the same, I think in the mainstream media, it's a topic that remains largely untouched. As I say, certainly anti-Christian persecution is left untouched, but I also think that other forms of that, like genuine anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and things like that, because those things do exist. Maybe I'm outing myself as something of a leftist here by believing so, but nonetheless, we'll sort of have a look at the overview. And the reason as well that we're going to be discussing these things today is because there's been a bunch of interesting reports on these subjects over the past couple of weeks. So as good a time to get into it as any. Um, I think to begin with, we're going to have a look at today is Red Wednesday. If you're not aware of what that is, it's sort of a global campaign to raise awareness of the plight of persecuted Christians around the globe. It's a occasion very much backed by Aid to the Church in Need. That's if I'm remembering correctly, a pontifical charity that focuses on, again, anti-Christian persecution, but also looks at global religious freedom. And this live stream just happened to be well timed. As I said, I completely forgot that this was a week of sort of focus on persecuted Christians, because they released a big report on this recently, all of which, by the way, you can find articles about on our website, because we do like to cover this one. Um, they released a report on the state of religious freedom around the world. And I do think it's a really interesting topic, whether you're religious or not. If you are, there's obviously interest in that. You want to take some spiritual solidarity with your suffering brothers and sisters around the world, whatever faith you may happen to be. And then if you're not, I mean, it's sociologically and anthropologically interesting. I don't know why that wouldn't be of interest. I am also going to remember to have a look at the chat here, because I'm an absolute divil for not doing so. We've got good luck coming through from Simon. Thank you, Simon. We've got, oh gosh, the praise. I would say I'm going to blush, except for the fact that it's really warm in this bloody room and my cheeks are already red. So Jason is coming to his own of late, as they say. Thank you very much. I'm glad you're covering. I'm going to start putting them up on the screen, because the producer is always telling me to do so, and he'd be raging if I don't. I'm glad you're covering this important topic. I agree, an important topic that, as I say, certainly doesn't get as much coverage as it ought to, given its importance and indeed its scale, as we'll be getting into. Mirko Madzer saying, "Our Lord Jesus Christ is King." At the risk of alienating anyone else, I'm still going to say I agree. Good for you. But of course, if you haven't come to that conclusion yet, you're very welcome here too. Hello to Mark Galvin. Phil O'Dowd, I believe Christians are in serious trouble. IMO, God help us. Yes, indeed. They are in trouble around many parts of the world. Although I do think we Christians in Europe do have a lot of difficulties. I'm not going to sugarcoat that. We do, and we're going to be getting into some of those. But we also can't have a persecution complex about it, because indeed Christ didn't, and we're obviously supposed to model ourselves on him. So, particularly when you look at the situations that some of our brothers and sisters have around the world, we have it pretty easy by comparison. But that obviously isn't to downplay the challenges that Christians and indeed all people of goodwill are facing. Um, I'm just gosh, a lot of comments coming through already. So yeah, I have to get better at figuring out how to divvy out, looking at these and looking at the notes as well. So I'm going to hop onto the content that we wanted to get into today because otherwise I'll just read comments all day, and I don't need you guys watching me to do that. So yes, what we wanted to look at today is sort of the initially we want to look at the plight of religious freedom more generally to provide sort of the backdrop to anti-Christian persecution as we're going to get into. And what better place to start than the sort of currently accepted basis for religious freedom, which is Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which reads, and I quote, "Everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. This right includes freedom to change his religion or belief, and freedom, either alone or in community with others and in public or private, to manifest his religion or belief in teaching, practice, worship, and observance." You don't need to be uh, constantly monitoring the situation, as they say, to realize that we're a far cry from reaching even that modest standard. I would hope that everyone watching this understands, and you're a clever bunch and tuned in, so I imagine you do. The importance of freedom of thought and conscience. They're pretty self-explanatory, even if an increasing number of our politicians don't seem to get it, and will be sort of when we focus in on the West in a little while and some of the difficulties that Christians and indeed all people of uh, sort of a contrarian streak in the present age find themselves rubbing up against. There's a lot of areas in which, say, yeah, freedom of thought and conscience are being targeted by. They certainly don't think they're targeting them, but being targeted by modern politicians and lawyers and indeed the media as well. If you're not religious, it might be easy to downplay the last element there, obviously freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. But you really ought not to downplay that element. That'd be an error. This is possibly controversial. I've argued with people about it before, but I am of the opinion that, at least the way I'll phrase it, is that everyone is religious. Everyone has a worldview. Everyone has a belief system that they adhere to. The only difference is sort of whether you are consciously aware of what it is or not. Um, it doesn't even have to be one that sort of traditionally espouses God. I mean, atheism is a worldview. Uh, if you don't even want to be metaphysical about it, secular liberalism is a worldview that comes with a whole load of assumptions and a whole load of consequences, as I would say we're seeing. So, nevertheless, this should be important to you too, because that religious provision as well, because without sufficient protections, your worldview, your perspective, where you're coming from, could also be targeted. So, I mean, I'm going to absolutely butcher this quote, but there's that famous essay that came off the back of World War II. Was it by Elie Wiesel, where he said, first they came for such and such, but I didn't say anything because I wasn't that. Then they came for such and such, and I didn't say anything because I wasn't that. And then they came for me, essentially. And there is an element of that at play in religious liberty. People do refer to that as a canary in the coal mine, because very often those are the first sort of groups to be targeted by authoritarian regimes, by this or that. So it's one that's really worth keeping an eye on. I'm just having a look at the comments, as I'm going to keep trying to getting better at doing. Is the north of Ireland banning Christian teaching in schools? I had seen headlines about the Christian teaching in schools in Northern Ireland. I can't confess that I have read up entirely on it yet. I'd seen a lot of legalese and details around it, so I can't probably possibly would write a comment on this at some point. But yeah, certainly it does seem that there was a ruling. I think I might have a brief note on it here. Yeah, there it is. The UK Supreme Court today, the provision of Christian religious education in Northern Ireland schools does not comply with human rights standards and is unlawful. Um, oh gosh, yeah, it's exactly this kind of thing we're going to be speaking about today. It's like doesn't comply with human rights standards. It's like what sort of human rights standards are they then? Um, Nevertheless, we're going to get into it. Let's see, Jason. Himalayas is back. It's officially time to black pill. It's officially time to black pill now. Himalayas. gonna have to send someone around to your house to give you a hug or something like this. It's not time to blackpill. With Michael Kelly coming through, a good friend of mine from ACN Ireland, which indeed we're going to be looking at their report today. Thanks for highlighting this issue. My pleasure, Michael, because it's a great report. So, without further ado, people are going to tune out because I'm just waffling here. Yeah, we want to look for we sort of looked at the secular basis for freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, which is Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Brief context on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That obviously was born out of the wreckage of World War II. The sort of community of nations came together to try and draft a document that would give a sort of common framework that would ensure that the carnage of World War II wouldn't happen again. Because people were coming from such diverse viewpoints and coming from so many different perspectives and faith traditions and cultural traditions and everything, uh, some argue that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a pretty watery thing, certainly compared to a lot of the traditions that would have been informing it. But nevertheless, it is what the international community has, and it is far better than nothing. I do think of it as a noble document. I mean, it's aspirational, sure, but I do think it is something that people can refer back to. And indeed, it has many good provisions in it that constantly are brought up in the face of sort of tyrannical overreach and things like that. So a very worthwhile effort all the same. So it's freedom of religion. It should also just be mentioned before we get underway that it's very much connected to essential rights like freedom of speech and expression and assembly and association. So if that's being threatened, you're getting into dangerous territory. And unfortunately, as we're going to see, it is being threatened. So without further ado, with much waffling out of the way, we'll start with Aid to the Church in Needs report, which, as I said, looks broadly at the state of religious freedom around the world. And then after that, we'll sort of zoom in on anti-Christian persecution. There's been a report out on that in recent days as well, which again, shameless plug, have a look at Gript if you want to read more about these things, because I've produced articles about both of them. So, Aid to the Church in Needs 2025 Religious Freedom in the World report. Um, the brief overview. Aid to the Church in Needs Religious Freedom in the World report 2025 concludes that there have been grave violations of religious freedom in 62 countries. That's a lot of countries. 24 classified as persecution, which is the worst category they assign, and 38 is discrimination, which is the second worst category. Hold on to your hats here. Uh, Not that my monotone's exactly going to send you over the edge, but that taken together, those 62 countries, that means more than 5.4 billion people around the world are affected. I was going to say 54 billion. Not that many. 5.4 billion people are affected around the world. So it is serious stuff. And it's shocking that the topic doesn't get as much coverage as it needs. So the 62 countries classified as under persecution or discrimination, as I say, affecting over 5.4 billion people, amount to nearly 65% of the global population. And during the reporting period covered by the report, only two of those countries, Kazakhstan and Sri Lanka, showed improvement. So, humanity report card F, not doing very well. I just see comments coming through. The priests and bishops say nothing, only clued in priests speak up. Listeners to my podcast with Ben will be aware of sort of what I think about Bishop's silence on what I would say are a lot of pressing issues. I do think it's extraordinarily disappointing that they don't speak out more often on many of these things. I will say, because I think as humans we do have a tendency to be particularly critical, they do have a tough job. I mean, it's not easy shepherding souls, but nevertheless, um, it's always worthwhile sort of giving a charitable exhortation to some courage to speak up on both, yeah, the difficulties faced by people abroad and also people in our own country. So, uh, look at that. Frank Barron, Neil Ainton Ton, Marta Hinton Fain. Uh, Very well said. And I'll put that up there. We do love a bit of uh, representation, Oscailga. So, back to the report. 24 countries are ranked in the worst category, persecution, as I said. That's characterized by grave and systemic violations, according to ACN, including violence, arrest, and repression. Uh, and these affect around 4.1 billion people. So the vast majority of those people in the countries experiencing these difficulties at all, which is pretty dire. The nations that this sort of primarily concerns are places like China, India, Nigeria, and North Korea. North Korea comes no surprise to anyone. People who do sort of follow these things, China won't come as a surprise to either. Very tough to be outwardly religious there in a way that isn't state sanctioned, hence the need for an underground church. It would make a whole another podcast in terms of sort of like I could speak to sort of Vatican diplomacy with China and things like that, and whether that's heading up a dead end or whether that's of any use, but that's a huge topic in and of itself. India's a sneaky one there because I think a lot of the time people don't think about that as being a particular. I feel like India is kind of doing its own thing, whatever that may be. But people don't think of it as being a place where there's sort of violent repression of religious minorities being carried out there, and it's really bad. There are a number of pages. I might put up a post on Twitter about this after, and I'll link to some of these pages or something like that, but I might not because it's late. That release videos of some of the repression and violence and mob violence, very, very especially that is conducted against religious minorities. That is Christians, obviously, but it is also Muslims very much there as well. And then Nigeria, as I said, is the one getting all the focus recently, courtesy of Nicki Minaj. Yeah, can't entirely be attributed to her, courtesy of the Trump administration. To be fair, they've really put the sights on Nigeria in a way that religious freedom advocates had been looking for the Americans to do for a long time. So anyway, in 75% of these countries, of the 24 countries that are ranked in the worst category, which is persecution, the situation has worsened. So the religious persecution has gotten worse. The next category, then, so 38 countries are categorized as experiencing religious discrimination, which is potentially affecting more than 1.3 billion people. Countries such as Egypt, Ethiopia, Mexico, Turkey, and Vietnam. I'm not going to say Turkey. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. Um, Religious groups face systemic restrictions on worship, expression, and legal equality. And so, while in a lot of these countries they're not subject to violent repression in the same way that they are in, like, yes, India and Nigeria and North Korea, nevertheless, it's a very stifling atmosphere for people of faith. Um, the report had said they're not subject to violent repression, and particularly with ACN eyes on this, I'm not going to dispute them. But I do think Egypt, say, minority religious groups do face some violent repression, like the Coptic Church, which is one of the oldest Christian churches in the world. Slight tangent on that topic. If you're interested in like, because I'm just fascinated in religion. I wasn't always. I was atheistic, but I've become fascinated by it, even as a human activity that people engage in. It's been said by a couple of people smarter than I that it's no sophisticated activity humans participate in, and I'm very much inclined to agree. And so, if you're interested in this niche topic, there's a great book, The 21, A Journey into the Land of the Coptic Martyrs by Martin Mosbach, a German author, which is about, the name might give it away, The 21. It's about the 21 Coptic martyrs of Libya. These were 20 migrant workers from Egypt and one from Ghana who were kidnapped and brought to Libya by ISIS. And they were all, you might remember, this was back in 2015. It was one of the most sort of dramatically choreographed ISIS videos. They brought them out onto a beach, all wearing orange jumpsuits, and they executed them in the sort of surf. And it's a book essentially about these men and where they came from and their background. And while it deals with the men sort of individually and has a good deal about them, it's also more broadly about the sort of plight of the Coptic Church in Egypt. So this is just well, not an entirely unrelated plug for that book, but it's really, really, really worth reading. One of the best books that I've read this year, certainly. Just to have a look back at the comments. Let me see. Um, yeah, as I said last week, it's kind of like tuning into an ongoing conversation. So, another comment here. I don't understand. Europe wants to be. The comments are moving fast. Europe wants to be politically correct and help everyone, human rights, etc., while their own people, Europeans, have the least right in being last and everything. Certainly, some Europeans that applies to in terms of their priorities being shunted right down the list. And seeing here, Tommy Hanlon asks, saying, "Good evening. So, was there some High Court ruling, and what are the potential ramifications?" As I can't necessarily speak to the potential ramifications yet, just because it was only sort of a decision issued today, but it does seem the UK Supreme High Court has ruled that, um, yeah, Christian education is kind of in violation of human rights. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know, man. I don't know how you come to. Well, I do know how you come to how you come to a decision like that, but that I think it's a disastrous decision is key. Andrew Doyle coming to us from Facebook. Good to hear you're engaging with the idea of faith. I pray you'll find guidance on the topic. Christ is King. Brother, no need to. You're preaching to the choir there. Unless you're speaking to someone in the comments, in which case, more power to you guys. Back to the matter at hand. So yeah, we had 38 countries categorized by ACN as experiencing religious discrimination, which obviously affects a massive number of people. And then one of the other major groups, nose is itchy here, it's driving me crazy. 24 countries classified as being under observation amid a surge in warning signs threatening religious freedom. And these include things like rising intolerance, the erosion of legal protections, religious extremism, and increasing state interference in religious life, which I think a number of Irish people, Europeans would say, yep, sounds about right. Sounds relatable. And it would be hard to disagree, because as we'll be getting into specifically towards the end when we're talking about anti-Christian persecution, there are a lot of things that have just been normalized in politics that are extraordinarily repressive measures. In the UK has gone insane with this stuff. Measures that essentially do criminalize certain kinds of thought. In certain places and things like that. So it's really crazy. But back to ACN sort of key findings or conclusions from their study. Authoritarianism is the greatest threat to religious freedom, they say. So countries that sort of are under authoritarian regimes are those in which religious communities suffer worst. These would be places like, say, China. Nicaragua is another one that sort of flies under the radar, but I suppose it would for we Europeans because it's not so close to home. But that's somewhere that religious are being treated absolutely horrendously. Another finding ACN had, which will come as a surprise to absolutely no one: jihadist violence, in their words, escalates, adapts, and destabilizes on an unprecedented scale. In 15 countries, religious extremism is a main driver of persecution. In 10 others, it contributes to discrimination. From the Sahel to Pakistan, jihadist groups expand through decentralized networks targeting Christians and Muslims who cannot accept the extremist ideology. This would be what's getting all of the attention in Nigeria at the moment, for example, where uh, it, militant Islamic groups are essentially running amok in large parts of Nigeria, it seems. Indeed, as I was doing up my notes for this just today, there was a video going around on social media of a church that was in the middle of worship in Nigeria when jihadists arrived in the village and started firing off their guns, as they're sophisticatedly prone to doing. So yeah, jihadist violence isn't going away, unfortunately, and that's one that seems to only be increasing. Another one that is really interesting, and that's also on the rise, is religious nationalism. That's fueling the exclusion and repression of minorities, religious minorities. National identity is increasingly shaped by ethno-religious nationalism, eroding minority rights. This is happening in places like India and Myanmar, in Palestine and Israel, Sri Lanka and Nepal. Um, As I said before, India is a really example of this. ACN said that they sort of exemplify, what was the phrase they used? Hybrid persecution, where you've got sort of two prongs. You've got legal suppression on the one hand and sort of political suppression, in that the Indian government's very much Hindu nationalist and is pushing that, combined with sort of very archaic mob violence, where you'll literally get mobs of people taking to the streets and driving religious minorities out of areas. So that's that India is personally fascinating to me, because it combines that very sophisticated form of repression with that very medieval, to use the term. Um, so looking at that today, yeah, someone commenting on what I just mentioned there, prayers for the Christians who were murdered and abducted today in Nigeria. Unfortunately, it is something that seems to be happening every day at this stage, which is dreadful. And not just that, but also kidnappings and ransoms. I used to work for the Irish Catholic newspaper, and we'd frequently report on priests and seminarians being kidnapped and held for money, essentially, in Nigeria. It's very common, yeah, happening nearly daily at this stage. Michael Kelly, again, very educated in these things, chiming in. There's a blind spot about anti Christian persecution. We need to keep pressure on the international human rights community and let them know it can't be ignored. Definitely, and I do think that this is a good time for that. We're living in a not a bad time for that. And that, as I said at the beginning, the Trump administration is bringing a lot more. Whatever you might think of them, this is one area that they're doing a really good job, bringing a lot more pressure to bear on countries that. Well, I say that. I mean, they're a little selective in terms of their approach. I mean, they're sort of cozying up to some countries that aren't too great on the old religious freedom front, but doing very well on others that have been historically neglected. So maybe a bit more of a mixed bag than I'm making out. But anyway, it's certainly an area seeing more activity than it traditionally has. ACN had also found a sharp rise in anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim hate crimes, and now I know many of us of a sort of contrarian bent hear the phrase, like, hate crimes and things like that, and immediately it's uh, you know didn't tune into the RTE live stream here. Nevertheless, there is some place for this, because I think when it comes to religious matters, a lot of the time these are carried out sort of directly targeting a particular group of people. And you only need eyes to see that this has been on the increase. I mean, look on social media, read newspaper articles, talk to people. I mean, if you go outside and talk to people, you see it, particularly following the October 7th Hamas attack in Israel and the subsequent war in Gaza. Anti-Semitic and anti-Muslim incidents both surged across Europe, on different scales, admittedly, but both leapt. Not just in Europe, but North America and Latin America as well. And I got some stats for you here, courtesy of ACN. So don't direct your thanks to me. In France, anti Semitic acts increased by 1,000%, nice round number, while anti Muslim hate crimes rose by 29%, which you might think is a bit of a disparity there. Um, Germany recorded 4,369 offenses linked to the conflict, up from just 61 in 2022. So that is a genuinely staggering increase. And again, it's one that I think, whatever your kind of position on these matters, I'm not telling you how to think about it. Um, it's one that can't really be denied. As I say, you don't have to go too far to find evidence of it. Both synagogues and mosques attacked. I've seen stories involving both of those. Individuals harassed, and speech targeting these proliferating online. And in many cases, government responses were essentially wanting, to put it politely, which only sort of feeds the sort of fear and insecurity a lot of these communities are feeling. So um, I did want to zoom in, obviously, first on religious freedom, because I do think that it provides a sort of broad background. I definitely, to speak more off the cuff, I do think that we live in an age of a sort of surging anti-religious sentiment. And I would say the sort of across the board difficulties that religions are facing, of, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim, anti-Christian, as we're about to get into. is evidence of that. I do think, indeed, as that Northern Irish ruling seems to suggest, as I say, I haven't fully read up on it yet, and so I'm reluctant to say too much about it. There is a fundamental lack of understanding about religion in the political world, in the commentary sphere, in the legal sphere, which is resulting in all sorts of difficulties for people who are religious. And that's a really bad thing. I've said it a couple times. I can't remember if I've tweeted about it, but I've certainly said it on a couple of occasions that if epidemiologists think, whatever you think about the pandemic, if epidemiologists thought they had it bad during the COVID pandemic, if they think they had it bad, if military strategists thought they had it bad at the outbreak of the Russia-Ukraine war, they got they don't know nothing compared to what people who know even a little bit about religion experience of the misunderstanding of this phenomenon in the world today. Like, it's materialism has done an absolute number on us in this sense. Just to have a look back in at the comments. We have one here. The term hate crime is subjective. It requires judges to be mid readers, mind readers, I presume that is, which they are more than happy to be in certain sections of society. How about prosecuting crime that objectively causes harm? Um, I broadly agree. I do think we should, by and large, steer clear from the not by and large, we should absolutely steer clear from the hate crime and speech thrusts that we're trying to do in the modern age. I do think there's an older precedent for sort of, incitement to hatred kind of legislation, or incitement to sort of sentiments that result in violence, that there is a place for. But I broadly agree. I do think we've sort of lost our minds a little bit with the hate concept, where any opposition to this or that train of thought is construed as hate. Indeed, again, listeners to our podcast will know that is Ben and mine's podcast. We were discussing a German NGO. One of the most like, I hardly know what to say about it. There's a German NGO that weighed in on Commission de Mond's investigations against X called Hate Aid. Hate Aid. And they're trying to make the case and popularize the case that digital violence, I kid you not here, digital violence is as bad as actual violence. This is the kind of like, you have that bell curve meme where you've got like low IQ people who the truth is more accessible to, and very high IQ people that the truth is available to. And then you've got like the majority of midwits who just can't seem to fathom why a thing is a bad idea. And I can't, God forgive me, I can't help but think that the Hate Aid office is full of midwits, because like the idea that digital violence is akin to actual violence is just nonsense. And they walk the walk. They offer, as in their own words, emotionally stabilizing counseling sessions to people who have suffered digital violence, but they won't offer it to people who peddle digital violence. So, as I said in an article on the topic, if you've been living by the digital sword, you just have to, from Heyday's perspective, put up with the consequences of that. So, we've got a question here from Tommy. Can I ask what must seem a simple question, but with the way Ireland is heading, I always thought that genocide was illegal under international law. Yeah, it certainly is. Can't this course be challenged in the ECHR? Um, I must be misunderstanding. I not sure exactly the context of your question, so I can't really speak to it. Um, I've got a comment here from Frank Barr. In a Christian school in England where Christian pupils were made to do Muslim prayers without the consent of the parents. Yeah, you do see things like that around Europe now. And again, a lot of this comes back to the just complete lack of religious understanding at large in the world today, where people sort of seem to think, oh, if you're a Christian, you can say Muslim prayers. If you're a Muslim, you can say your Christian prayers. It's very common to do, like, I don't know. I'm not opposed, say, to school trips to different religious houses of worship. I do think it's, I mean, like, for example, I'm all in on Christianity, as I've done on nearly every stream so far. You know, the house is like an Orthodox church here with the icons in it. But nevertheless, I find other religions extremely interesting. Well, even phrasing it other religions is a very modern way to put it, but that's a conversation for another time. But like, I'm fascinated by Islam, and I find mosques really interesting places, and I find the history of the development of these different faiths and traditions really interesting. Um, Colby, great discussion, by the way. Really enjoying these new live streams. Very kind of you. Thank you. But that's all just to say that I'm not opposed to like schools going to, different houses of worship or different things to learn about these, or indeed learning about different faith traditions. But I do think, yeah, when you sort of think there's no problem with, forcing kids to pray this or that way according to a different faith tradition, yeah, that's not good. And that would be very much opposed to, I suppose, Article 18 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But anyway, we're getting way off track here. So, um, ACN also took note, of course, as that, and this is their sort of main beat, I would say. So, less to be thought. It was left as an afterthought. Anti-Christian incidents are on the rise across Western countries. Europe and North America witnessed a significant rise in attacks against Christian sites and believers. In 2023 alone, France recorded approximately 1,000 anti-Christian incidents, while Greece reported over 600 cases of church vandalism. In Canada, 24 churches were targeted by arson between 2021 and early 2024. Similar spikes were observed in Spain, Italy, the United States, and Croatia, including desecrations of places of worship, physical assaults on clergy, disruptions of religious services. And these are often driven by ideological hostility and militant extremism, the usuals, you might say. Um, yeah, this can't be denied. There's another report we're going to be looking at now in a few minutes, and I realize we're already getting on. I mean, I just must be able to talk for Ireland, as they say, because I feel like I've only been talking for a few minutes, and we're nearly 40 minutes into it here. Um, there's a lot to this. I mean, the one in Canada is a prime example of how this wave persecution and repression and things like this, or certainly ideological hostility, is based on fabrications and lies. I mean, there was a wave of church burnings in Canada, as I say, between 2021 and 2024, and a lot of that hostility was stoked by the belief that residential schools in Canada were the sites of sort of mass burials of Indigenous students and children. These were schools that had been presided over by the Catholic Church and by the Canadian state. Um, and this really gained legs to the point that Pope Francis, on a trip there, made extensive apologies and things like that for it. Uh, Now, unless there's later data that disprove this, the last I checked, which was just a couple of months ago, despite scanning and doing intensive research, they hadn't found a single body in the sites of in some of the most contentious sites, say, of these industrial schools. So it was an example of, yeah, a lie getting halfway around the world before the truth had even gotten its boots on, and to disastrous effect as well, because, as I say, these churches were burned to the ground. And whereas Justin Trudeau and his government were very quick to call out, anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim sentiment, as indeed they should, there was very little said about the burnings of churches. So the last thing I'll say from the ACN report, their finding, before we get into sort of specifically anti-Christian persecution, was that conscientious objection is increasingly under threat. Again, according to ACN, this is manifesting itself in different ways, in like places like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, and Russia. Individuals refusing military service on religious or ethical grounds have been imprisoned and sort of socially stigmatized. Um, in Western democracies like Belgium, the UK, Ireland, uh, people of faith, people who have sort of moral objections to different services like abortion and things like that, are facing growing pressure to sort of cave on that. In Belgium, for example, faith-based institutions are under growing legal pressure to provide services like abortion and assisted suicide, both of which are at a very advanced stage in that ailing country. And this is something, as I said, that isn't limited to Belgium. This is happening all over the place. I mean, how often have we seen in Ireland, despite the fact that a massive number of people voted against the repeal of the Eighth Amendment, uh, in the years since then, those who held that perfectly reasonable and I would say correct position um, have been made to feel like social outcasts, have been made to feel like moral monsters. That in and of itself is a sort of violation of Article 18, you would say. Uh, just having a look back at the comments here. Yeah, Buckle Full, I think I'm pronouncing correct. Trudeau paddled a lie and still hasn't retracted the lie, which is about those schools, and the church is targeted invariably service Native American Christians, which is this is always the way. I mean, there's always a hidden kind of irony in these things, which is that people will attack these churches and then they service the Native American or the what do they call them in Canada, First Nations populations and things like that. So you have that. I'm just there's a lot of comments coming through here. Sean O'Sullivan. The only trouble is when I pin these comments, it makes it look like I'm tooting my own horn here, and that is not the intention. Although not your primary role, yourself and Ben are the most prominent religious speakers in Ireland. Thank you kindly, Sean. It is funny to say, not my primary role. This is one that, like, it's kind of indistinguishable to me from just my work. I mean, people without faith feel as free to sort of, peddle their worldview as anyone else. So, like, we'll just, advise Christians, you have as much right to the public square as anyone else. So, you know, it doesn't, no surprise, I suppose, that I would be talking about these things. Um, Now, on to the next report because we're running out of time. Uh, well, it's a bit of an arbitrary judgment because I'm the one controlling the stream. But anyway, um, another report that came out just the other day, this week, so hot off the press, as they say, is from OIDAC, which is the Observatory on Intolerance and Discrimination Against Christians in Europe. I know some of the people in that organization, so I would hope they don't mind me saying that it's not a name that rolls off the tongue. Regardless, they're doing very worthwhile research and observation and advocacy because they found in this 2025 report more than 2,200, if I'm remembering correctly, the exact number is 2,211 anti-Christian hate crimes carried out across Europe. Um, in 2024, I think was the year that they covered. So according to OIDAC, which is I'm going to refer to the organization for the sake of simplicity, the figure includes a spike in personal attacks, which increased to 274 incidents last year, up from 232 in 2023, and a surge in arson attacks targeting churches and other Christian sites. Now, keep in mind, whereas ACN had a sort of global interest and was looking at the global situation, this is looking exclusively at Europe. OIDAC found that France, the United Kingdom, Germany, Spain, and Austria saw the highest recorded numbers of anti Christian hate crimes, with the NGO's executive director, Anya Tang, warning that behind the numbers are very concrete acts of church vandalism, arson, and physical assaults that deeply affect local communities. So yeah, the same sophisticated communities across the board. There were a couple of particular incidents OIDAC highlighted over the course of the past year of interest. So incidents they highlighted include the murder of a 76-year-old monk at a Spanish monastery in November 2024. I remember that one in the news. Other people were injured in that one. An ISIS-related attack during Sunday Mass at a Catholic church in Istanbul that left one man dead in January 2024, and the near total destruction in September 2024 of a historic church in, oh boy, a French name, Saint Omer. Take cut my French pronunciation. That's not going to happen again. As a result of an arson attack. OIDAC independently documented 516 anti-Christian hate crimes. And this is where I do feel like there's validity to like designations like hate crimes, despite the fact that that phenomena can very much be weaponized and is being weaponized. Because I think many people, indeed those watching the stream and those interested in the topic, would conclude that these crimes are done out of, to put it very traditionally, odium fidei, hatred of the faith. And I don't think I think that it's very possible for, yeah, crimes to be done out of pure hatred, so there is a place for that kind of designation. But anyway, they found that that figure rises to 1,503 when theft and break-in incidents at religious sites are included. Um, I think that the reason in some reports there's a bit of a discrepancy around the numbers is because data collection around anti-Christian crimes, say, or crimes targeting Christians or indeed other denominations is patchy at best. It's not the sort of thing that's collected in the same rigorous way that indeed hate crimes of different stripes are being, and I do hate crimes in that instance because I think there's a sort of dubious element to them where, you didn't go along with someone's sort of preferred pronouns and you got someone logging a hate incident with the country's police force. So there is some individual judgment has to go into on an organization's part, has to go into deciding what to classify as a hate crime, what to classify as a hate incident or things like that. So that's why I think there is probably some variation in the figures offered by different organizations, but nevertheless they generally trend in the same direction, and so they are of use to us. That said, um just under 100 arson attacks were recorded by OIDAC in 2024, a figure almost double 2023's total, which is obviously very concerning. One third of these occurred in Germany. So, tut, 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 Germany. You got a pretty nasty anti Christian culture growing there. The Bishops' Conference in Germany, in fact, warned that um, all taboos concerning sort of the vandalism of churches and things like that had been broken in Germany. So that's not great. I think you'll agree. Even in countries that have historically been predominantly Catholic and haven't really experienced these kinds of issues, are OIDAC was noting that data suggests from those countries that there seems to be a phenomena of underreporting incidents targeting Christians. A prime example is my adoptive home, Poland, which obviously everyone is well aware. It's always touted as a bastion of Catholicism, and indeed there is that there. I mean, the south of Poland is extraordinarily Catholic by the standards of 2025. The picture is a little bit more complex than it's often made out to be. There's a lot of the key indicators for these things are falling off and heading in the wrong direction, like plummeting numbers for uh how the heck am I for seminary? How am I forgetting the word for where go to train priests? Plummeting numbers for seminaries, plummeting, falling numbers for mass attendance. So you'd say some pretty key indicators there. Nevertheless, it's still a much more Catholic country than most other places, and because of the fact that it's at the tail end of the sort of secularizing trend, who knows if some other trend will introduce itself that reverses that. But anyway, back to the point at hand. The executive director of OIDAC highlighted a survey from Poland, which found that almost half of the priests surveyed had experienced aggression in the past year, but only about 80% of those priests said that or over, sorry, my mistake, over 80% of those priests said that they hadn't reported the incidents to the police. This is this is a real problem. I have a lot of friends who are priests and a lot of friends in different countries, and sort of the abuse they face is a regular and a growing thing at this stage, and they'll be the last to speak up about it because many of them are really good men, and indeed religious sisters face this as well, and they do try to take this in the properly Christian spirit of turning the other cheek. So it does fall to the laity, and indeed this was people with a platform to make an issue of it, which is that yeah, they'll be walking down the street and they'll see the habit or the priestly collar, and they'll give abuse on that basis. Indeed, interestingly, an old clip resurfaced from then Bishop Robert Prevost, who is now Pope Leo, in which he said he hadn't experienced such a flip in a culture as he had in Ireland, where he said he'd been walking down the street on a visit to Ireland and he was minding his own business, but on the basis of the fact that he was wearing the priestly collar, a guy sort of viciously verbally attacked him. And but for the fact that I think it was just verbally, I don't think it was physically at the time anyway. But say, well, obviously, if you're not particularly fond of the church, you'll be inclined to say he's lying. But if you are willing to extend him the benefit of the doubt, as I think indeed there's a good reason to do so, um, he said these experiences personally, so it's not the kind of thing that can just be uh, kicked aside. Um, just to quickly rush through the rest of this report. Yeah, if half of the as Anya Tang said, who again is the executive director of this organization, said if half of the Catholic clergy experience aggression in what remains a Catholic majority country, hostility towards Christians can no longer be treated as some marginal issue. And I think she's exactly right about that. I do think this is one that, again, obviously people who are of these traditions are going to be sensitive to because they're the ones experiencing it. I know sometimes people are inclined to say that they're being overly sensitive, and I think at the margins there is some of that. But by and large, you know, people aren't making this up. There is social pressure and hostility um, on the rise, and there has been for years now against Christian belief. The final sort of element that we want to touch on here is aside from hate crimes, OIDAC and other organizations, great organizations like ADF International, which is really making waves in its work at EU level and at national level in different countries. They've identified multiple cases of legal or social restrictions affecting Christians across Europe last year and indeed into this year. Some examples cited by the observatory included prosecutions for silent prayer under the abortion buffer zone laws in the UK, which is these, we have them in Ireland as well. There are these zones surrounding facilities that provide abortion where you can, offer pro-life advocacy, or indeed, as is the case in these instances, you can't even stand there silently in a manner that'll arouse sort of suspicion in a passerby or in the police. And that's the prosecutions they're talking about here. There's a couple of cases. It's Isabel Vaughan Spruce in the UK and Adam Smith Connor, who were two people who were just standing within the buffer zone, uh, for all intents and purposes, to a normal person, looking like they're minding their own business, but they were praying in their head, as is their right. So praying silently, and nevertheless, the police came along and asked them what they were doing. And when they admitted to praying and standing there as a sort of silent witness, they were had the book thrown at them essentially. And I would encourage you to go out and have a look at those videos because they're genuinely shocking. You have the ongoing prosecution of Finnish MP Päivi Räsänen for quoting the Bible to critique her church's stance on pride events. And that's ongoing. She is a living witness to the fact that the process is the punishment with a lot of this business. She's been consistently vindicated by the courts, and she's been consistently dragged back to the courts by the prosecution, to the point that, if I'm remembering correctly, her case is now before the Finnish Supreme Court, and should be issuing a decision within the next month or two regarding her guilt or lack thereof. And then the observatory also cited the legal difficulties faced by British teacher Christy Higgs for expressing concerns about sex education content on the basis of her Christian views, which is something that gripped readers and an Irish audience will be very sensitive to, given some of what we know about sex education contents in 2025. So there were far more cases of these sort of legal and social hurdles that Christians, and I would say people of sort of moral objection to a lot of modern practices. You don't have to be Christian to be pro-life, but indeed, non-Christians who espouse pro-life views will be just as much, put under the thumb for sharing those views as a Christian will be. Nevertheless, I mean, there are just a lot of anti-Christian things happening. I mean, a couple more of the cases that they cited were a Swiss court denying public funding to a Catholic girls' school, arguing that being a Catholic school reserved for girls, the school would practice discrimination. A Spanish case which saw a father barred from reading the Bible to his son. granting the secular mother exclusive authority over the son's religious education. A last one I'll cite, which they cited, a French court ruling against a teacher who used a text by Saint Bernadette in a local heritage class in France, and she was done in on the basis that it constituted a breach of neutrality laws. So, all of that said, a spirit of repression and persecution is alive and well in Ireland. I think that in Ireland and in Europe and indeed in the world, I do think it's something that's growing. I do think it's something that, unless there's significant pushback on, isn't going to get any better or get any easier. And it indeed, as I said at the beginning, and as ACN highlighted, it does act as something of a canary in the coal mine because it's linked to a number of other fundamental rights like freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. So, just having another look at the comments here because I've been very neglectful throughout the stream. Sean O'Sullivan, do you think at best the church is naive or at worst ignorant of the current anti-Christian sentiment? The Pope should gather leaders of Christian nations to denounce such attacks. No, I don't think that they're ignorant about the current anti-Christian sentiment. I do think that, and again, this is all very this differs depending on what country you're in. Like, for example, you'll have Nigerian bishops speaking out very powerfully against this in Nigeria. Um, and you'll have they're well aware of this in the Vatican, and indeed they try to approach it in different ways. In Ireland, I've said this on the podcast. I do think that the clergy and the bishops could risk speaking out a little more regarding sort of anti-Christian, and again, even more broadly, conscience trends and things like that, because there's lots of opportunity to do so, and a lot of those opportunities are passed by. Just looking through a question here. Jason, have you seen the signs the English councils put up? Google them. Literally a return to the penal laws here. If you walk past with a rosary out, that could offend someone. That could offend someone if someone saw it. I presume you're referring there to the buffer zones that I was speaking about. And yeah, they are crazy. I've seen some of the pictures of signs where, indeed, like, even if I remember correctly, when these laws were coming into place, it was the case that if you had like pro-life signs outside the front of your premises or your house, and that happened to be inside one of these laws, you could be sort of liable for um, that meek protest. So yeah, it's crazy, and you don't need me to tell you that. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of that. But we've gone way over the time I planned on doing. I told our producer before this I'd be doing 30 to 45 minutes once again. But you're all such good company that uh, it pulls the speech out of me. So I think without further ado, we'll leave it there. Of course, as I mentioned, if you're interested more in these topics, you can have a look at our website. Both of those reports that I mentioned, I've written articles about, and I think in those articles I linked to the reports themselves. And there's just a lot more reading can be done on this topic. And indeed, I think if you're all faith, you can of course pray about this, as I try to remember to do. And if you're not, it's just the sort of thing that you can keep abreast of because, again, it does concern fundamental rights. Um, so I think we'll leave it there. But thank you all again for joining me this Wednesday evening. I'm very much enjoying it, and I'm happy that a growing number of you seem to be. And we will catch each other again next week with some topic that will come to mind over the course of the next week. So God bless and stay well until then.